This is a real pleasure to have an opportunity to present this workshop organized by a well-known association, and my presentation will be about some additional or obscure aspects of assessment of development and modernization. And I will focus on theoretical points, as well as will provide some empirical material concerning participation rates in Eastern and Eastern European countries and Western European countries. So I will start with a description of problem background, and as you know, the previous decade was sometimes called decade of emerging markets. So what happened? It was actually boom of growth everywhere, but especially it was growth in so-called third world. And the question arises whether there was a shift of balance in the world, whether new players came. And there was also rapid development of Eastern Europe. For instance, in Ukraine in 2004, the growth rate was 12%. A couple of years, double digits. So Ukraine was kind of China in Europe. And other countries like Poland, for instance, they also made a huge progress. And there was a question whether this growth meant change of situation in these societies. On the other hand, the global crisis, which happened unexpectedly, also had a different impact on the core and the periphery. And at the first point, it seems that the core benefited. When the crisis started, the Eurozone was really secured, and the Economist journal wrote that it was really nice to have the common currency. Meanwhile, other currencies of emerging markets countries, they suffered. But later on, the core societies, now we know that especially in Europe, they have some problems, and some societies didn't have problems. Like China, or in Europe, Poland didn't have any recession. And some societies, like Ukraine, had real dramatic decline of GDP. It was one of the biggest decline in the world. It was 15% of GDP decline in 2009. So, in global world there is a very acute competition. And competition is sharpened with the global crisis. And if even in good times governments were obsessed with the growth, and now in bad times they are really even more obsessed with the growth, because growth provides security for any political regimes, democratic, authoritarian, and to secure this growth, political elites in some countries like Ukraine and Russia, they started some politics of modernization, of what they call modernization. And modernization basically is perceived as a way to build innovative and competitive on the global market economy. And there is one important implication. For some societies, modernization also means technological development and reaching prosperity, become prosperous society, but without some additional attributes of such prosperous society, which is associated with Western democracy. So the question is whether the growth of emerging markets is sustainable. From history we know that the growth doesn't necessarily mean that there are structural changes, and society can go back very, very quickly. And there is a need in profound structural societal changes behind the growth. is modernization true? The modernization which is focused on technological innovation and economic growth. Modernization implies that society should move from periphery of global capitalist system to the core. And it is really debatable whether any of emerging market societies move to the core of global capitalism. Before the global crisis, emerging markets were really vulnerable, and they were dependent on external flows of capital, and they still now are vulnerable, as we see from recent publication in The Economist magazine. They're in a different position. Some societies are pretty in secure position, like Russia, for instance, or China. And other emerging markets, they are really dependent. And if something happens on financial market, global financial market, they will be in trouble. But the question is that this is not all about economy. And modernization and development, it's not just economic growth and growing prosperity, but also to get this sustainable pace of growing prosperity. There should be some societal changes, some specific features of society, namely some special institutional rules and some features of social agents which are more capable. And there are two main streams in the literature. The first is universalistic, that everyone is going on the same way, and the other one is that we have multiple modalities. And the question is whether any society is open to modernization. Existing research shows that growing prosperity, for instance in Russia, especially where prosperity is really noticeable, doesn't produce change in values, expected change in values, and there is still a gap in values between post-socialist and West European societies. However, according to modernization, this universalistic modernization model, value shift is a prerequisite for further growth. And this shift accounts for growing democratic institutions. Why values are important in this process? Because what actually is their criterion of modernization? Criterion of modernization is a growing capability of social agents in pursuing their choices. And assurance of agent's choice is achieved via access to the resources, via motives, namely values of action, and effective institutional rules that guarantee access and pursue goals. So modernization eventually empowers people. And this is a model of human empowerment model modernization proposed by Ronald Englehart, Preston Welsel. It's a very logical and very humanistic. Actually, we have at the top, we need to have enough resources for people, so we need really well-functioning economy. So it's what actually all governments want now. Then we have a layer of self-expression values which motivate people to pursue their goals. Otherwise, so we have plenty of resources, but people just are not aware of what kind of goals they can achieve. And then we need some special institutional rules, some special regimes that entitle people to govern their lives. So this is really a logical and humanistic model, but whether it's true or not, this is the question. And the question is that this human empowerment is not automatic, involuntary process. So people are not get this power from the governments. To get empowered, they have to be engaged in civic activities, and they have to implement some pressure on the governments. So, prerequisite for increase of the capabilities as eventual success of politicization is a more full inclusion of social agents in the different spheres of society. So I will skip the concept of social inclusion. Actually, I devoted half of the paper submitted to this concept and was criticized by the convener for that. So the only thing I say that social inclusion concept embraces not just groups that are considered in the literature as deprived groups, but it's a concept which can be used as an analytical tool to understand ways of securing human choice. And social inclusion can be measured via various, it's not the only way of measuring social inclusion, but one of the straightforward ways of measuring social inclusion is measuring indicators of participation. And existing research demonstrates that established democracies, they have higher participatory rates than less consolidated democracies. And Eastern Europe and Ukraine in particular, they are behind Western Europe. So if we look at the selected countries to see their standardized participatory rate, we will see that some Western societies, they are above the average, and like Norway is a standard deviation above the average. And below the average, not just Eastern European societies, but also some West European societies, basically Mediterranean societies. This is ESS data, and I tried to check the same assumption using EVS data from the end of 1990s till the end 2000 years. So there are three kinds of participation, and first political participation, and what we can conclude from the data is that different kinds of participation, political and civic participation and social participation, they are mostly stable, and there is also some there are some patterns in societies. If we see, for instance, declared interest in politics, and basically in all diagrams, we will see that on the top, above European average, we will see Western European societies. But sometimes, like Ukraine or Turkey, they can be above average in declaring interest in politics. But if we look at real practices, for instance, the mainstream practices attending demonstration, political demonstrations, or any other gatherings and meetings with, at which some public interests are pursued. So East European societies, they are behind Western Europe, and especially in more unconventional ways of political activities, such as joining boycotts. Mostly Scandinavian countries, they are on the top, and we will see that most East European societies, they are below average. This is just descriptive statistics, but it informs what is behind the overall participatory rates which were calculated by the research in the previous research. Civic participation is important since it is linked to a type of civic culture, and is also stable except the membership in trade unions, which declined significantly over decade in majority in countries. And especially important activities, voluntary work for organization in human rights. Of course, the number of people who are involved in such activities is very small, but still we will see some differences, especially in East European countries. This number of people is very close to zero. And social participation is a third type of activity which is linked to solidarity, cooperative behavior, mutual help. There is also discrepancy between declared intentions and real practices. If we look at the number of people who are willing to help their neighbors, we will see, for instance, that Romania is pretty high, it's on the top, as well as a declaration whether people are willing to help elderly people. Romania is on the top of this graph. But to compare with the real practices, of course, it's also quite small number of people who are active, who contribute their time and resources. But still, the same trend we will see that West European countries, they have much more people rather than East European countries. What are the factors of participation? On the country level, in the previous research, there was shown that efficient governance, level of GDP are the main predictors for different kinds of participation. Of course, it's quite. We should be cautious about statistics made on the country level because it concerns like 30 countries, and still it also connected with the descriptive statistics which was shown before. That in more developed societies, participatory rates in almost all kinds of activities are higher than in less developed societies. As for individual level factors, we can compare. Actually, this is a logistic regression, so we can compare effort size of these factors, unfortunately. But we can look at the significance of the factors and the direction of the relationship. And the only significant predictor for instance, Germany as a West European country and Ukraine and Russia as post-socialist countries is the level of education. Meanwhile, income level is significant just in Germany and not in Ukraine and Russia. It's also interesting that satisfaction with life is also significant, highly significant in Germany, is on the margin in Ukraine. So, I'm coming to a conclusion that we can see differences between West European societies and East European societies, although there are unique patterns in each society and some special activities are more popular in one society and less in other society. And as previous research claims that on the country level, such measures of development as effectiveness of governance, law enforcement, and economic prosperity are important predictors for participatory rates. Although I would notice that there are also theoretical grounds to consider this relationship in other way around. And this is a question of whether relationships are recursive or non-recursive. And there are some grounds to think that high participatory rates, the political rates and civic activities, they can eventually produce more efficient governments and enhance institutional rules. And on the individual level, education is the main predictor of being involved in civic and helping volunteering, and poverty is, as often considered, is not an obstacle for participation in Ukraine and Russia, because increasing income doesn't result in growth of activity. And it means that people who have higher incomes, they don't have intentions to contribute their resources and their time to other people, to society, in contrast, for instance, to Germans. And this is a risk for future development of Eastern European societies. And despite any growth rates of GDP, if social agents do not acquire such features as mutual help and intention for cooperative behavior and civic engagement, any economic reforms and any technological innovations, they will remain very unstable. Thank you very much.
So please, your questions and comments. We have sufficient time for discussion and questions. Please. Yeah, please.
Thanks very much. This was a very interesting presentation. I really enjoyed it. A few comments and questions for you. So on one slide you presented the question, is growth under authoritarianism sustainable? And I was sort of surprised that in that discussion we didn't get at what I sort of see as the key point in this literature, that authoritarian systems are good at making big capital investments, they're good at saving, but they're bad at facilitating innovation of both an economic and social variety. And they're bad at that, this literature argues, principally because they're bad at offering the kind of secure property rights and legal culture and climate, the institutional infrastructure that would support innovation. So that was a comment for you. On the Wessel and Engelhard human empowerment model, it really doesn't get at this whole world of socialization and material incentives that face agents in contemporary non-democracies, I would argue. So the mechanism for value shift in that model, and according to the theory of social mobilization that they and others like Lipset and the older modernization literature argue for, is meant to be education and increasing occupational specialization or autonomy in the workplace. But if we look at the actual processes of socialization that take place in the workplace of democracies or fragile democracies, I think we see a whole nother set of processes at work that model just doesn't capture. On the protest participation measure that you used from the EVS, so this is a tricky one, right? Because it asks about protest participation. Have you ever done it? Might you do it? Or are you never going to do it? So essentially comparing across the democracies where protest participation has been possible essentially for the lifetime of the respondent, and the new democracies where protest effectively has only been possible for the last 20 years over the post-Soviet period, is a bit of a problematic comparison. It's
actually due to disparate and political opportunity structure. Of course, participating or volunteering for human rights in Belarus means absolutely different than volunteering for human rights in the Netherlands.
Mhm.
So of course, the meaning of this action is different.
Yeah. Yeah, that's right. And if you ask a 50-year-old respondent from a former Soviet state whether they've participated over their entire lifetime, you're really probably only asking about that last 20 years. Whereas if you ask a 50-year-old respondent in Western Europe, the political opportunity structures being more open has allowed them to participate over their whole lifetime. So the cumulative effect is going to look different. Last, is a quick point. The correlation or relationship between level of development and participation, so as we know from this big literature, this question really mirrors the development and democratization question. It's hard to say that it's causal. I think you brought up in the conclusion the idea that the relationship might be recursive. I think we also have a big literature that suggests that that there might be omitted variable bias, that there might be some institutional conjuncture at a point in the past that set countries on, different paths of development that might explain those two things. So, those are my comments.
Okay, thank you. Actually, in the economics literature, there are some discussions that it's not important for economic growth whether the regime is democratic or authoritarian, but important to which extent it reduces their frictions for economic transactions. So it means that basically it's it can be authoritarian, but if it's good in managing investments and innovation, so it's fine with this regime. But my tentative assumption, of course it would need more argument, that it can produce some success at the initial stages, but in the long run there will be a problem because there is a gap between state institutions which are focused on development and social agents which maybe are quite far from this. And we will see what happen. We will see what will happen in China in a couple of decades, of course. But it's, now we can argue that it can be a problem.
Sorry.
No.
Only a small question. In the beginning of your speech, you told that Ukraine like China in Europe. What do you mean?
No, in this particular case, I said that before the crisis, in 2004, Ukraine had growth of GDP 12%, and it was 11%, I think, in 2003. So, a couple of years, it was two-digit numbers of GDP growth. It's not common for, of course, their comparison level was really low because of this huge fall in the 1990s, but still it was really fast growth, and the situation changed dramatically due to global crisis.
And also, what was the structure of this growth? So please.
Yeah, you just said that this political activity is from one point of view the prerequisite for modernization, from another point of view it can be such like the result of modernization, so it may be some reciprocal relation between the result of modernization and such variables like political activity, social activity and value. But my question is, what is the correlation and what is the relationship between, just as you see in empirical data, or you can expect a relationship between the values and the activity and the modernization? Because you just told only about the participation.
Well, it's an interesting question. It's behind the scope of my presentation, but in terms of this modernization model, value shift is necessary for any further advancements. So if there is no value shift according to this model, we hardly can expect for a rise of democratic institutions, and without these democratic institutions we can't expect this human development. My point is that regardless whether there is a value shift, if social agents they are not involved, if they are not active, we can't expect any other advancements. And of course, it's a problem to measure any relationship between post-material self-expression values in countries in Eastern Europe because of really small number of people who share such values, and this relationships are not significant in Eastern Europe. So it's quite difficult to say what is going on right now.
In early work, Ingrid and his colleagues said that value shift was a result of economic growth.
Yes.
And what is the relation? What is the first? Economic growth and value shifts and economic growth or democracy or
They insist that economic
because you
growth
just
is
said
first.
that it's possible to have economic growth without democracy. It's one we have such example. No democracy, but good economic growth. But what is the general trend? What is more important, and what is the relation?
And one small addition to your comment. We can take, for example, such country as Singapore, with authoritarian regime. Also, this is enlightened authoritarianism, but there is also very high level of grassroots activity of ordinary people. Under authoritarian regime, and ordinary people are very active at the grassroots level.
Civil society in authoritarian regime.
It can be a very interesting option, so maybe we can expect some hybrid regimes like that, because if authoritarian regime allows such activities, it may help for future development. So answering the question, so they insist that economic growth comes first, but my point is that it may come and it may produce some results, but it can't be sustainable in the long run unless there is this activity from below. So if there is activity from below, regardless whether this regime, what kind of regime it is, in the literature it is argued that activities of people and people can be engaged in different types of social spheres only if there are some institutional rules which correspond some principles of democratic society. But if authoritarian regime will produce some possibilities for such activity, I'm not sure whether it is possible, but in some cases, like if there is some special cultural ethic, for instance, as in Singapore, for instance. There is one more question.
Last question.
Yeah, thank you for your presentation. I have a very small and practical question about your comparison in terms of income. So I was wondering whether your data allow you to control for working hours of individuals. Because my suggestion would be that voluntary participation is possible only when people have time for this. And I would say that in poor countries like Ukraine, people who have higher income, they still work more than 8 hours per day, just like poor people. While in Germany it can be not really the case.
Well, interesting point. No, I didn't control for that. But actually, according to resource model, people who have more resources, in advanced countries, people who have more resources, they are able to participate, because people who don't have resources, they don't have time, they don't have money. So if they don't have time just because they need to work more, Well, it's an interesting point, but basically it's also a pattern in some poor countries like Ukraine, that people who have more working hours, they actually don't earn as much as people who probably work less, who have several jobs and trying to survive. Well, it's worth some separate study on this point.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, thank you very much.